Wonderful. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is Sustainability. It is a weekly little happening that we do here at UNCW Sustainability to focus on a different topic every week in all things sustainability. So this week we are focusing on environmental psychology, which is such an interesting interdisciplinary field. And we have a fantastic guest speaker slash interviewee today. Her name is Alexa, and she is a former partner with Sustainabili-Tea. She is a graduate of UNCW in communication studies and psychology, and she's a current graduate student in social psychology at the University of Connecticut. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Alexa, about you?
In terms of some of my work while I was at UNCW, I'd first like to say thank you, Avery, for that nice little introduction, and thank you, Kat and the Sustainability Office for kind of hosting this. I'm really excited to be here. In terms of my partner work with Sustainabili-Tea, so I had the opportunity to do a research project, even though I was not majoring in environmental sciences or kind of a field that you might normally associate with sustainability. I was able to kind of combine my interests with psychology and communication studies and the environment and kind of help co-produce a survey with another student at the university and able to assess attitudes and then interview administrators on campus. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and I'm really excited to share more with all of you today.
Wonderful. We are glad to have you. So we're going to start with a basic definition of environmental psychology from the American Psychological Association, and that is a multidisciplinary field that investigates the effects of the physical environment on human behavior and welfare. So that kind of gives you guys a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about when we use the words environmental psychology. So to start us off, we are going to ask Miss Alexa, what does environmental psychology mean to you?
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to kind of start off with a slightly different definition. So I really do like to recognize the APA's definition. However, another one that I'm more familiar with, how I was kind of introduced to environmental psychology, is it's an interdisciplinary field that focuses on the interplay between individuals and their surroundings. So the field kind of defines the term environment very broadly, where it encompasses not only natural environments, like we think of kind of the great outdoors, but also social settings and built environments. What I mean by built environments, that's going to be homes, buildings, anything that humans have kind of constructed. And then as well as like learning and informational environments. So this field, as the APA definition suggests, is very much multidisciplinary. And so in that way, I've kind of come to know environmental psychology from this kind of social perspective. So understanding that humans, we are like actively in a relationship with the environments that we encompass, whether that is inside or outside. And so some of my research, hopefully in the future, will kind of be looking at those two broad aspects. So that's kind of my relationship to environmental psychology. It hasn't been quite very direct, but it has definitely been tangential.
Awesome. All right, so pretty general, you can take it however you'd like, but how are humans impacted by their environment?
So coming from that social perspective, given that that's kind of more of my realm, I really like to think about how people are impacted by their social situations in the environments that they're in. So whether that's looking at maybe behaviors and attitudes and interactions in really large group settings versus maybe one-on-one, or just maybe how you even would potentially explore an environment when you're by yourself versus maybe with some friends or a group of strangers that you don't know. So I like to think that we are very much impacted by our environment. That's my personal perspective, and that it can influence our behaviors. It kind of influences our beliefs and how we see the world. There's also, I recently heard of one study where they were looking at development levels of children, and they were finding that there were certain motor skills that children who grew up in more rural areas where like there was more farming, for example, how they developed certain motor skills faster than they found that compared to children who didn't grow up in those sorts of settings. So I think that's just like one small example of how our environments can really shape us. And as I mentioned before, I like to think that we're in a relationship with our environment, and that goes both ways. So we impact our environment, and then it also impacts us.
Absolutely. So on that note, is nature specifically one of our environments associated with therapeutic qualities?
So there is more research that's being done on this specifically, and I can talk about one program at the University of Connecticut that we're hopefully going to be launching in the near future. Those plans have been put on hold because of the pandemic. Obviously, it's made things a little bit more complicated. But yes, to briefly answer this, there are some research and data supporting the notion that there are therapeutic qualities of nature. Some of those can be studied within like the realms of health psychology. And so that's going to be looking at like physiological measures in association with health behaviors, that sort of thing. So maybe getting people more involved in outdoor activities, that sort of thing. There's also, of course, clinical psychology as it relates to looking at mental health in terms of options for therapeutic qualities. And also environmental psychology, of course, kind of folds into this. So you can see how there's a lot of different disciplines that relate to nature in general, the environment, and then therapeutic qualities. Specifically, the program that I was speaking about, so at Cornell University in 2017, they actually launched a Nature RX program. And essentially, the idea with this was they had started to see some data supporting this notion that there were certain benefits from people being out in nature more often, some of which included, let's see, I have a few listed here. So ability to concentrate and increasing attention span. So some improvements with cognitive ability specifically, positively benefiting your mood and improving your overall sense of happiness, as well as reducing feelings of physiological responses to stress. And then kind of another one that they saw is going to be an increase in social connections and quality of your social relationships. So there's some data supporting this. And what Cornell did is they took this program and then they mapped out on campus like spaces where people could kind of explore or kind of go when they were prescribed these lots of time that they should spend in nature. So it was in collaboration with their essentially their health department, mental health and wellness department, as well as the urban development department and some other different departments there. So you can see that there's, again, a collaboration between different disciplines. And the purpose was they would have students, and if students met certain criteria, the professional would maybe recommend that for them, it might be worth it to try this type of therapeutic process as opposed to others. That, of course, always varies on a case-by-case basis, but they would prescribe that somebody maybe spend 30 minutes a day or 30 minutes 3 times a week out in nature. And then they would give those different spots where they could go, and also in kind of the surrounding area in town to try to accelerate it. And they did see some benefits with the program. So that's something that the University of Connecticut's hopefully been trying to implement a similar program here so that we can try to help address things like stress and promoting well-being in maybe a different manner than we typically think of.
Could you see nature becoming a more popular element of therapy in the future?
Personally, I would say yes, with a big it depends after.
Mhm.
And the it depends is, so these are going to maybe be cases where there's not as like severe levels of maybe stress or anxiety or things like that. So depending on the appropriate treatment, I think that this is something that maybe other colleges might be willing to implement going forward, especially given that there's a lot of differences when you come to college for the first time. Maybe it's the first time you're living away from home. So there's all of these different factors that are coming into play where this might be a very realistic kind of treatment option for some group of individuals that also doesn't maybe hold as much stigma as others think with mental health, as we hopefully try to destigmatize that as well.
Awesome.
Mhm.
All right. So eco-anxiety, many of us have it, especially those working towards some sort of level of sustainability. How does that connect to psychology, and how did you know anything about how our current society is dealing with eco-anxiety, or if you deal with eco-anxiety?
Uh, Personally, I feel like I do have some level. One thing that I thought was interesting, so in terms of like diagnostic qualities, like formally for psychology, I don't believe this is like formally recognized as a disorder or anything along those lines yet. However, there is more research that's being done on this as we start to kind of look at maybe more implications of climate change. Um, so I actually did a little bit of research because it is a term that I've become more familiar with recently. I didn't realize that there was actually a term for this. And one out of an APA bulletin I had found, they had defined it as a chronic fear of environmental doom, which I thought was quite grand of a definition. So in that way, I'm like, okay, maybe I'm not that far along that scale, but definitely in terms of the overlapping overwhelm, that there seems to be a lot of things potentially coming up all at the same time, and how do we deal with that along with our daily lives in a healthy manner. So the point that I wanted to kind of draw here, in my opinion, I think that eco-anxiety, it really connects to like the clinical aspect of psychology. You of course will see crossover with environmental psychology, but that idea of health psychology and clinical, so more in the context of mental health and like what that means for individuals who do experience eco-anxiety. Uh, One other thing that, and I can send an email to you if you want to send that to other people, where I looked at the APA press release. So I would say it mostly relates to mental health, and that does seem like an area that probably in the next 5 to 10 years we'll hopefully see more research being produced out of there to see if there's maybe particular interventions that can be put forth, or other ways that we can learn to adapt our behavior and kind of manage this overwhelming sort of feeling.
So, how does psychology relate to social justice and the environment?
Mm-hmm. So broadly, I would say psychology in general, it's made up of a lot of different disciplines. I've touched on a few already. So I would say that there's multiple disciplines within the umbrella of psychology that relate to social justice. And I kind of relate them to social justice in, it depends on maybe like what you're researching, or if you pursued in a higher a degree, a graduate degree in psychology, and then went maybe into the nonprofit sphere. So there's ways where not only psychology, but other disciplines can then connect to social justice in the environment. One specific program that one of my other graduate students does that I think is really, really cool. But this summer, she actually had a internship with the US Forestry, and they were looking at greening programs. Now, when I say greening programs, essentially what they did is they had areas, so they looked at 2 particular cities, and they've been running these programs for at least 2 years now, but they organize communities, so where there's vacant lots. So vacant lots are lots that are not taken care of, and they would organize local community members, so whether that was church groups or other organizations within the community, and they would help green specific lots. Now, they did not green all of the lots, so they used that as kind of a comparison to see if this greening of these areas maybe had improvements in health benefits or a reduction in crime rates. So the main focus of one particular program was crime rates in these specific areas. And those 2 cities that they were looking at, they were comparing Philadelphia and then also Flint, Michigan. And so they greened a bunch of different areas, and then those community organizations, whoever they had rallied, were responsible for maintaining those plots of land. So you see community involvement there, that you're having the people in that community hopefully have an appreciation for this space. And across 2 or 3 years, they were showing reductions in certain types of crimes in those areas. So there does seem to be some effect of potentially shifting the environment, whether that's just in kind of an unconscious cue that, oh, this space is something that we take pride in, that we take care of. Another kind of idea is that, well, maybe because the lot's not vacant and there's not a lot of like high grass or other random trash items there, that there's less spaces for people to hide drug paraphernalia, for example, or other things like relating to crime. So I think it's really interesting to see in this particular case, this is a great example of how studying a community and then also rallying the community, seeing if it's something that they actually need. And then in this case, improving the environment. So hopefully making it a space that then community members can use for a different purpose. So they would tend to put grass in the areas and then maybe like a small fence along one side, kind of as a physical barrier to say like, this is a different space. Sometimes they would put a bench in it or a tree. So it would depend, but they would tend to need to make sure they were like mowed on at least every 2 months, something along those lines. And they tried to keep track of those. And then they did a lot of surveying of community members. So that would just be one example of like psychology relating to social justice and in the environment. And there's many, many more. That's just one that I've been lucky enough to be aware of and learn more about myself.
That sounds like a really awesome project. Yes. I've heard a lot of really great things about collaborative community gardens assisting in those sort of regenerative processes in communities, which is amazing. Very, very cool.
Other
for sure.
Fun
Yeah, go
thing
for it.
in regards to sustainability, sorry about this point.
Yeah.
One in Philadelphia, you might be able to just search in Google for kind of greening programs in Philadelphia, but they had like a map of like all of the different places that they had greened across Philadelphia. And then they actually had some spots on the map that were yellow instead of green, indicating where they did like pollinator gardens instead. So they are kind of doing some different things where I think it's interesting and a great way to, of course, change how we perceive the environment and then hopefully benefit both parties in this case. So
absolutely, a pollinator garden would be a great opportunity for education as well. That's really, really cool. Awesome. Love that. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much for your wisdom. I've certainly learned a lot. And then we want to open up the floor to anyone who has questions for Alexa. Does anyone have any